What have we learned so far? So we started out with the simple bank, small, relatively straightforward business. Somebody in the break said to me, yeah, but doesn't that sound boring? And I said, yeah. And I always think that there's a couple of people that you want to have a boring profession. So I like my prime minister to be boring. I don't need an exciting prime minister or president. You know, keep him boring, that's fine. And I would not have anything personally against having a boring banker. So I understand that for the bankers it's not so attractive, but personally I think a boring banker is just fine.
Are you a banker?
I was once, yeah, and a central banker, and then I saw the light and I became an academic. Did you guess where did you take that from? Okay, we can talk about it later. Yeah, I made a remark when I left banking about ivory tower, and it was very funny because the people that I was talking to, which were bankers, presumed that I was talking about academia, and which makes sense, and I was actually talking about banking. So I think I walked away from that conversation. I thought, and I'm making the right decision. But that's nothing negative about banking. That says more about personality, I guess. So we went from having this small and relatively boring bank to a bank with lots of bells and whistles. And we've learned a few things, I think, along the way. So we learned that, you know, the change from small banks to large universal banks. Universal banks is a way of talking about these banks which do a lot of different things. Is economically, at least, is hard to motivate. It's kind of funny because in the U.S., the CEO of what is it called again? No, the big bank. What was the merger between the bank and insurance company? AIG. Exactly. No, not AIG. Citigroup. Exactly. The CEO who started Citigroup, which was the first big merger in the US of a bank and insurance company, actually before that was even legal, so they basically forced the legislation through, recently went public and gave a lecture and said, you guessed it, there should not be any universal banks anymore. So he very much changed his opinion. We also saw some evidence of negative effects. So does this actually have an effect? Well, one of the things that I talked about was this idea that banks appear to have become too big to innovate. So they're just basically fat and lazy in a way. But if you remember the story that I started with, some people in the break are asking me something about it. That was not the context or the subtext, maybe I should say, of the story that I started with. Because the story that I started with was one friend saying to another friend, but how could you? Because you knew. So that was, to some extent, a story about banks. And I told you it was a story about banks in Iceland, but it could also be a story about banks in the Netherlands or anywhere else, namely these banks that were too big and promising things that they could not promise or should not promise, and also selling products that maybe were not so smart. But it was also a story of a customer who just basically walked right into the trap and did not think very clearly, perhaps, when he or she bought the product or bought into the dream, so to say. Think of the example that I gave about the investment mortgage, right? A friend of mine, I remember when she got such a mortgage at the time, we were both doing a PhD in economics, and she said, what do you think of this? She was working on things very different than banking, etc. And she said, you're a banking expert, what do you think of this? And I said, well, it sounds to me like gambling with borrowed money. And I would not advise that to anybody. So In other words, banks do not operate in a vacuum, as it says there. There's also the rest of the economy. So let's look at that a little bit. So banks and the economy, what can we learn? So I talked about two different phenomena. So let me briefly remind you. One was income inequality. This idea that actually what we see in developed countries, not in developing countries per se, but in developed countries, is a big difference between blue collar, white collar, between the most productive and the least productive people in the economy, between those that earn the most and have the most capital and earn the most also from capital instead of from labor, and the rest. And the other thing that I talked about is this change, this huge change in the structure of the world economy. The rise of China in particular, but to some extent also the rise of India, of Brazil, etc. Countries that, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to trade, are very, very big, but when it comes to finance, the size of their banks, the size of their banking system, the size of their financial markets, the size of their stock markets, bond markets. Has anyone ever received an offer from your bank to invest in the Chinese stock markets? Now buy our China fund? I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. I don't even know actually if it's possible to do that, to be really honest. So there are these inequalities. There are these things that actually potentially could cause some tension. And I want to sort of pay tribute in a way, I guess, because sometimes we're also fans. I want to pay tribute to two people I think who have done research that is very important for understanding the crisis and where it comes from, but also for maybe making the whole system a little safer. I want to point out two things. So one of the things is, and you can see to some extent when you see the dates of the research that will appear in a second, one of the things I want to point out is that they said these things already to some extent way before the crisis. So, in other words, economists did not see this coming. Yeah, not true. There are some people who actually not only predicted it, but also predicted why things would happen and how they would happen, etc. And the other thing I want to point out, just because it's kind of fun, is that one of them actually is now the president of the Central Bank of India. So at least India made a good move, I think. So the one who's the president of the Central Bank of India now is Raghuram Rajan. And he wrote a paper with another favorite economist of mine, Douglas Diamond. And the title of the paper was The Credit Crisis, Conjectures about Causes and Remedies. And the paper appeared in one of the top economics journals, the American Economic Review, in 2009. But as these things go with research, the paper was already written. Earlier drafts circulated years before this. And I'll talk on the next slide about what Rajan exactly predicted, but for now, let me point out, remember what I said about innovation, another paper that the same guy actually wrote in 2005, or at least it appeared in 2005, again it was written already a lot earlier, and it said, has financial development made the world riskier? So, I'm going to ask again for help to my backbencher. What is the documentary again? The crisis. The one that we've seen many times. Inside Job, exactly. Has anybody here seen Inside Job, the documentary? Yeah? If you've seen Inside Job, then you've seen Raghuram Rajan. He's one of the people that, one of the economists that appears in the documentary Inside Job and does not have to be embarrassed, actually. So, unlike quite a few other economists. And the other one I want to mention is Hashem Pesharan, who, not coincidentally, last year received an honorary doctorate from Maastricht University, actually, for his work. And he's done a lot of work on this financial inequality. And the one paper that I want to mention, but there's more, just as is the case with Rajan, is China's emergence in the world economy and business cycles in Latin America. So you already see an interesting thing about this title, China and Latin America and business cycles and the world economy, so what's going on here? So he's one of the people that is actually trying to tie all these things together and saying, hey, it's not individual countries, it's not even just having finance here and the economy here, but it's all one big system, and what happens if actually things start developing unequally in that system. And this was published actually in, unfortunately, somewhat minor journal, but it's still a paper that had a lot of impact. So let's talk a little bit about these two people and what they've said. So first, Rajan and income inequality. So I encourage you to actually look them up and find out more about them, because especially for Rajan's work, it's very accessible as well, very well written, and a lot of it is non-technical. So even if you're not an economist, if you want to know more about this and understand what has been going on, I think that the paper that I just mentioned, you can also find free versions on the web. It is a fantastic way of understanding at least part of what has been going on in the world economy in the last 15 years. So what he does is he talks about workforce competitive issues in the globalization era. What does that mean? We start producing, it's just the common story. We start producing our clothes in somewhere in the Middle East or in China. We have a lot of high-tech, high-paid jobs, and maybe also jobs in the finance industry still in our own country. But what do we do with the people in our own country who are not so highly educated, and what kind of jobs do they get, and also what kind of income do they get from that? But then he makes an interesting argument, and he says, well, remember that these developed economies, they're democracies. So if these income inequalities that result from this, so in other words, he's not attacking, just to be clear, income inequalities, but he's actually talking about the differences in terms of the opportunities that people have, in terms of how productive they are, and in terms of what they can contribute to the economy. If these differences are becoming too big, he says, well, that can actually cause tensions in a democratic system. Because in a democratic system, if you want to actually be a ruling party, you need votes. So, and one of the consequences of that can be that we try to actually sort of let these people also profit from the overall growth of the economy. And how can we do that? We cannot do that by paying them more wage, because they're simply not very productive. So what we do is we give them easy access to credit. And this goes in all kinds of different ways, whether it's so-called subprime mortgages in the US, right? So basically mortgages to people who maybe should not have received a mortgage, certainly under those conditions, or it goes in some other way. But in any case, we give easy access to credit. And that's tricky, because easy access to credit, remember what I said about risk, and risk is great, but if risk is not priced, or at least not priced correctly, then it's a problem. Well, easy access to credit creates all kinds of bubbles, whether that is a housing bubble or another bubble. So I start a long quote from an interview that he gave to Foreign Affairs, actually more of a general interest magazine, and he writes, "The industrial countries should treat the crisis as a wake-up call and move to fix all that has been papered over in the last few decades. Rather than attempting to return to their artificially inflated GDP numbers from before the crisis, governments need to address the underlying flaws in their economies." And then he talks about what he means. And he says, in the US, that means educating or retraining the workforce who are falling behind, encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation, and harnessing the power of the financial sector to do good while preventing it from going off track. In Southern Europe, by contrast, it means removing the regulations that protect firms and workers from competition and shrinking the government's presence in a number of areas, in the process eliminating unnecessary, unproductive jobs. So in other words, create a dynamic economy in which everybody actually can benefit and has the right incentives and abilities to contribute productively. Because if you don't do this, there will always be these types of credits, always be these types of tensions from politicians trying to actually lure people into their corner by giving them something which they may not ever be able to repay. It's an interesting link, and I think an unusual link between economics and politics. And he was heavily criticized actually over this when he discussed it at a big economic conference, and also before and after. But, well, let me be a little bit careful. I think it's definitely an argument that's very, very worthwhile to think about. So, what is Pecheran's argument? And again, a quote actually from his own paper. He says he's written a paper that investigates how changes in trade linkages between China, Latin America, and the rest of the world have altered the transmission of international business cycles to Latin America. He finds evidence for 5 large Latin American economies showing that the long-term impact of a China GDP shock, so in other words, China's GDP increases or maybe drops, on a typical Latin American economy has increased by 3 times since the mid-1990s. So what does that mean? It means that if growth in China is not 8% or 11%, but 3%, the negative effect that drop in growth in China has on these Latin American economies, and these are the big ones that he looks at, is 3 times as high as it was only 10 years earlier. It's a big change. And he says, while the long-term impact of a US GDP shock has halved, and while the transmission of shocks to Latin America and the rest of emerging Asia GDP has not changed. So if you want evidence of how the world has changed and what that means, not necessarily just for us, but also for other people, this is a kind of evidence that you need to look at. And he says these changes owe more to changes in China's impact on Latin America's traditional and largest trading partners than to increased direct bilateral trade linkages boosted by the decade-long commodity price boom. Now, and he says that these findings have important implications for both Latin American and international business cycle. What are these implications? So he doesn't explain it in detail in the paper that I cite here, but he did when he gave his honorary doctorate speech when he was invited to Maastricht. And the argument that he makes is very, very simple. So we've seen a huge increase in the GDP, the growth, the wealth in China in particular, and to some extent also in India and in Brazil. But like I said already, financial development has not really kept pace. So if you are a middle-class Chinese person, or Brazilian person, or Indian person, and you also want to invest some of your wealth, and you also want to diversify your risk when you do so, you invest in New York Stock Exchange or maybe somewhere on Euronext or whatever it is. But even if you want to, it's not so easy to do the same thing in your own country. And likewise, if you're a wealthy Dutch or American or whatever it is, a person in Europe or the US, and you say, oh, I would like to also invest some of my wealth in the Chinese Stock Exchange, not so easy. So think about what that means. It means that where the money is being created, so to say, in terms of productive assets and trade and production, and where it is being invested or where you can invest it, is very, very different. So if you would make 2 maps of the world, and you would make one map in terms of trade, and then you would make another map in terms of investment, ideally, if you go back to early economic theory, you would say, well, comparative advantage, so a little bit here, a little bit there. And when you talk about trade, even though you have this huge rise of China, if anything, it's restored the balance a little bit when it comes to trade. But on the financial side, things have not kept pace. And we have a very well-developed financial system in some parts of the world and not so much in another part of the world. So the implications, this is not something that Pecheran would say with those, exactly in those words, but in my own words, I would say, well, maybe we should start thinking about saying to the Chinese and the Brazilians and people in India, hey, isn't it time for you to actually develop your stock market as well, open a bond market, open it also to foreigners, and try to actually get things a little bit more in balance. And just to be clear, I don't say this out of we'll get even or fairness or these types of things. No, in terms of stability of the whole system. So think about it. Income inequality and financial inequality, and I think we can learn a lot about those things in terms of what we can do to not just necessarily make the banks safer, but at least make the economic system a little bit safer. So before I move to some kind of to lessons that we can draw from all this, I want to point out at least a few of the things that we did not discuss tonight, simply because of, well, time constraints, basically. So I did not really go into that much detail about bank regulation and the role of regulation. Also, what we didn't talk about is what economists would call regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is very simple. It's related to banks becoming too big to fail. It's also related to all kinds of ties, whether it's lobbying or otherwise, between the institutions that supervise the banking system and the banking system itself. And as a result, the regulators are captured by the system and are no longer really independent. Sustainable growth. So sustainable growth, when we used to talk about it in economics, we talked about things like, the environment, etc. But you could argue that if you have the type of growth that every now and then leads to a huge crisis of the type that we had just recently, that's not very sustainable either. So maybe we should think about that. A tricky topic. I think a very difficult topic, scenarios for bank failure. So any kind of system where, or how should I say this? Don't think that we can create a system in which no bank will ever fail. There will always be bank failures. But what we can think about, and what we should think about also after the crisis, is what do we do if a bank fails? So what's the scenario? How do we do this? Who should get bailed out and not? Who should pay for what? And how do we resolve this in a way that in the end the taxpayer ends up paying the least possible? It's not entirely clear what is the best way. Pay and performance, right? So bonuses, big issue. I will tell you a small story though about pay and performances. So I was giving a training to some bankers, not me, giving a training to some bankers some time ago, actually during the crisis. And these were senior bankers. And it was a training of a couple of days spread out over a couple of weeks. So in order for me to not be talking like I'm talking now all the time, I decided to play a little game with them. And I played the game that I set up twice with them. So the first time we just played the game. And the game was as follows. So I divided them up in groups of 3 or 4. And I said, you are a bank. And here's some information about clients. One for you, one for you, one for you, one for you. Remember, you're a bank together. And you have to think about, these all want a loan, and you have to think about what kind of interest rate you would charge to them, and the conditions, and I set it up nicely. And by the way, here's your performance scheme. So I gave them the type of scheme that is typically also used in banks, where there was some kind of bonus system. Yeah? And then I said, okay, now go each into your different corners, 4 by 4, and actually start talking about this, and tell me what you think you're going to do. So these are all senior bankers, so men typically, gray suits, pinstripe. They have a lot of ego and testosterone, and they're willing to show you that they made the right decision and that they can do this. And in all fairness, they did a nice job, because I asked them all to come back and present to me, what do you think you're going to do? And then we took a break, just like we just had a cup of coffee, blah, blah, blah. And then after the break, we came back and said, okay, so now we're going to play the game again, but I'm going to change one rule in the game. And you may think that it is related to the bonus scheme, and they thought so as well, but that's not what I changed. I said, no. What we're going to do differently this time is very simple. So the way that I set up the game originally was that, let's say that you, and you are a bank. The way that I set up the game initially, and I did not say this like this explicitly to them, but I did set it up this way, is that you should think about the risk of the interest rate that you got from your client. You should think about the interest rate that you got from your client, and you should think of the interest rate that you got from your client. But all you had to think about in terms of the risk of your client was the average risk of all the clients. Because hey, let's face it, we pool all those risks, right? We put them together. And remember what I said? about risk management. It's not adding and subtracting, but it's multiplying and dividing. So, well, surely the overall risk is less than that of the individual clients. So, in essence, what I did is I created a system where, effectively, if these three are a bank, there was a silent fourth person who was the risk manager, and they could just pass on the risk to the risk manager, and all they had to worry about was the money that they make, the earnings. So the rule that I changed is when we played the game again, I said, okay, one change. Now, you also have to take into account the risk of your client, because your performance scheme is going to be exactly the same with one change, namely that now it depends on the realized return of your client. So in other words, if you decide to charge your client an 8% interest rate and he doesn't repay and you lose, then you lose. Not the bank loses, but you lose. Needless to say that the kind of loan contracts that they came up with and were interested in offering to their clients were very different than the ones that were before. Now, why did I play that game with them? Partly because I wanted to make a point, and partly because I wanted to test whether my intuition was correct. So let's talk about my intuition first. So my intuition was that everybody talks about pay and performance and these huge bonuses that these bankers make, and the idea that they only have an upside, right? If things go well, if they're lucky, so to say, then they get a huge bonus, and if things don't go so well, then society pays, right? And to some extent, that's true. There's something to be said about that, right? I think it's fair to have a discussion about these bonuses. But I think to some extent, and now again coming back to your remark after the break, I also understand these bankers a little bit. Because if you think about risk management, then to some extent, any organization, not just a bank, but any organization that does risk management, does exactly that, what I did the first time that I played the game with them. Because if I have an organization, a bank, I'm going to make money, and I'm going to have people who sell and make money and do these things, and then I'm going to have other people, and they're going to manage the risk. And the implicit idea in the organization is that you need to sell, you need to sell, you need to sell, but we only need to think about, if anything, the total pool of risk, the average risk. And in principle, that is not a problem necessarily. However, what did I say at the beginning of the lecture, in my view at least, do all crises have in common? That those diversification gains that are the implicit advantage in that setup that I just discussed are gone. And that's what I wanted to show, that's the point I was trying to make to those bankers, that the reason why their pay performance scheme maybe was not so optimal is not necessarily just because they were making a lot of money, it's because the money that they were making was not reflecting the actual risks that they were running if those diversification gains were not there. Now, what is the typical example of a banker if you play a game like that? Yeah, but what are you talking about? We all know that those diversification gains are there. That was why it was ideal to play that game at the beginning of the crisis, because they could no longer make that argument, because at that point those diversification gains were not there. So the second time that I played the game was a more realistic version of the game at that point than the first time. So I think that whenever we start having a talk about pay and performance and how we need to do this in banks and related to risk management, it's great, but then we also need to talk about risk management itself and how much it relies on that implicit assumption that there's always these diversification gains. If we talk about a different way of banking, then I increasingly think, this is not sort of academic, not based on my own research, but I personally increasingly think that then we also need a different type of risk management, where the risk manager is much more based on getting to know exactly what risk I run with that client that I am now giving a loan to, rather than always relying on pooling risks and spreading risks and thereby getting rid of a lot of the risk. Simply because we know that in the time when we need risk management, that pooling does not work anymore. So a little bit of evidence, and what I talked about is the risk of correlations. So what kind of lessons can we draw so far, and what are some suggestions of what we should maybe do? And what I try to do both with the lessons and the suggestions is I'm going to pool things a little bit, because I think it's realistic to always talk about both sides of the coin. And I want to try at least, whether it's about the lessons or about the suggestions, to avoid easy solutions. So let's see if I can do that. So the first two. Do not buy or sell a financial product you do not understand yourself. It sounds really, really simple, but try it. Try applying it. And I wonder whether you always pass the test yourself. So someone can... Yeah. So somebody came to me in the break and asked me about the first year finance course, the bachelor's course in finance that I start teaching next week, and said, are you going to be talking about these types of things? Well, one of the things that I always ask the students when I talk to them about stocks and bonds, stocks, higher return, but also higher risk, right? I always ask them a trick question. So you are not allowed to say anything to your fellow students now, because you now know the trick I'm going to play with them. I wonder when this goes on YouTube, we'll see. But I always ask them a trick question, because I ask them, I say, look, you're now studying economics or business, and you're at a birthday party or something. And I know that this is, for an economics or business student, this is a realistic situation. Some family member comes to you and says, what should I do? Should I invest in stocks or bonds? What do you say? And by then, 80% at least says, stocks, of course. It's not the right answer. It's also not the wrong answer. It all depends. How risk averse or is the person that you're talking to? What is the risk appetite of that person? How much risk do they want to run? Do they understand the risks that they're running? So I say, by the end of this course, I hope that when your aunt or uncle or whoever it is asks you that question, you say, okay, good question. Should I invest in stocks or bonds? How much risk are you willing to take? And then you start talking. So avoid the simple answers. And like I said, do not buy or sell a financial product you do not understand yourself. But also, and this is something that, since there are a lot of you are foreigners, maybe you understand a little bit what I'm talking about. I myself am Dutch, but and we are famous in finance for inventing a lot of insurance products, right? The Dutch are great at inventing insurance products. Some of the earliest insurance products were born right here in the Netherlands. But I think sometimes we've gone also a little bit too far, and we think we have this illusion that we can live in a riskless world. So an example, maybe not from finance, but one of the things that for me always stands out, I always remember this as a bizarre event in the crisis, is that the entertainment group, they were literally called the entertainment group, in the Netherlands went bankrupt. This was an organization or a company. One of the most famous Dutch singers was one of the shareholders of this company, and they were organizing concerts. And this company went bankrupt. So as a result, people had bought a ticket for one of his concerts, and they could no longer go to the concert because, and they also could not get their money back because the company was bankrupt. And a Dutch minister actually went on the radio and said, I think it's time that we start talking about having a fund for these types of things, because it's terrible that these people cannot go to their concert, and we should have some kind of emergency fund so that these people can get their money back if this kind of thing happens. The idea that you can insure yourself at a reasonable price against all of these types of things, and that is worthwhile, is something I think that is actually potentially very, very dangerous, because you create kind of illusions that you can protect yourself against all kinds of shocks. And I can tell you there will be other bank crises as well, and they will come from different directions, and we won't see them coming, and they might be worse or they might be less bad. So the one thing that you can do is not be naive and realize that you cannot live in a riskless world. It sounds simple, but I think it's still a hard lesson for people to learn. So that brings me to the next 2 points. So insurance does not reduce risk, it moves it. It reduces risk for you, but it moves it into the hands of somebody else. And this is one of the things that I think was a big lesson also for a lot of supervisors. So in the last years, if you look at central banks and other supervisory agencies, they started talking about what they call macroprudential regulation. Remember when I talked about bank regulation, I said, well, there was these Basel Accords, and a lot of it was based on the idea that if we make banks safer, then we make the system safer. And I already showed you some results that show that there's a big difference between banks and the system. And what supervisors mean when they talk about macroprudential is exactly this, is saying like, oh, we should not just make banks safer, because if we make banks safer, but they all are exactly alike, then it means that if there is a shock, if something happens, they also all will suffer from this shock at the same time. And that's not good, because then each individual bank is safer, but the system is not necessarily safer. So we need a little bit of diversity in the system, and aware of the total risk in the system, not just for an individual bank. And it sounds, again, very, very silly perhaps, but the second point is that risk that is priced is always better than risk that is not priced, or maybe not priced correctly. So think about what I said about a free lunch. If you get offered a financial product and it seems like it's too good to be true, I'm willing to put money on it that it is too good to be true. So there's certainly in the types of products that we are offered and buy, it's impossible to get a free lunch. So if you're offered a high return, you bet you're running a lot of risk. Moving to the banking system itself, two lessons I think that are important to think about, at least from my perspective. So one thing is we do not need the types of banks we have now. Exactly how harmful they are is another matter, and I think that's really difficult to research, but I hope I've given you at least some evidence before the break that economically speaking, banks do not have to be that big, they do not have to have that scope, and as a customer, it's not obvious that we benefit from having these large banks. One of the things that I keep trying to say to regulators and supervisors and competition authorities is that, and that's the final point on this slide, we cannot understand the prices banks charge without knowing more about the costs they incur. So again, during the break, somebody asked me about, do you ever talk to any of these supervisors and other institutions? And I gave some examples of things that I did. I was involved a few years ago in a study about competition in the Dutch mortgage market. And the first thing that I was an advisor to this study, and the first thing that I said is, well, okay, then we need to know a lot about the cost structure of these banks. And the people who asked me to advise them said, no, we want to look at the competition in the market, so we want to look at the prices. I said, yeah, but if I go to a bank and I get offered 5% or 6% interest, to pay on my mortgage, how do I know if that's a fair price? It depends to quite some extent on how much it costs the bank to offer that mortgage contract to me. If one bank is offering, saying, well, you have to pay 6%, and another bank is saying, well, 5%, but that's because that bank has 1% cheaper costs, okay. Whereas if they have the same costs, hey, now something's going on. So you cannot understand risk, you cannot understand competition, you cannot understand a lot of these things that are going on in the banking sector by only looking at the prices that they charge and the profits that they make. You have to also look at the cost side. You have to know what the bottom line is for them before you can understand where they're making money. And I think with a lot of things in economics, it goes beyond banks actually, there's a natural emphasis, I understand why it exists, but there's a natural emphasis to look only at, what are we paying for it, instead of thinking, and what does it cost? And whether that is your iPhone, or your mortgage, or your car, or the taxi service that you buy in the Netherlands, which a lot of foreigners think is very, very expensive. If you want to know whether it truly is indeed very expensive, you need to know what their profit margin is. Think about the bubbles that I showed you before the break. You need to know whether indeed these bubbles are becoming bigger. I could have shown the same graph, like I said, for the newspaper industry, and you would have seen exactly the same trend. But the big difference was not in that trend, in that move from small banks to large banks. It was that in the fact that as this happened, certainly after these economies of scale had been exploited, these bubbles started going. So you need to look at it in that way. So some suggestions. This is always really, really difficult, and I have to admit that when the crisis started, as I think was the case for a lot of my colleagues, if people ask me, so what should we do? I was very, very hesitant, but since I'm an economist and I work at university and the taxpayers pay my money, I'll pay my salary, I think it's fair that they also expect some answers. So one of the things that I think is really, really important is the first bullet point on this slide. So I was an advisor to the Dutch Parliament, parliamentary investigation in the Netherlands, the Commissie de Wit on the crisis and how to handle it. And one of the things that I try to pitch with them, and I've tried to pitch it many times, and I've never, I have not yet succeeded, so I'm going to keep on doing it, is I gave the example of insurance, health insurance in the Netherlands. So hopefully this is something that's going to appeal to a lot of you. Do you have, you don't have health, do you have for the foreigners, do you have health insurance here in the Netherlands? No? Okay, I see some people not. So let me explain how it works. So in the Netherlands, at least in recent years, how it works is as follows. So if I'm a health insurer, whether I'm Dutch or from somewhere else, and I want to compete in the Dutch market, I can. And I can basically offer any kind of product that I want. However, I have to offer some basic products that are defined by the government. They say, look, you have to offer this type of insurance package. Yeah? And if you want to offer additional stuff, you can, but you have to offer this. And what that does is, I think what it does is, in a market that has a tendency to go for what economists call monopolistic competition, which means avoiding price competition by making your product very intransparent and hard to compare with other products, it forces these companies to, at least in some parts of the market, compete on price and be transparent. So, and in the health insurance market in the Netherlands, actually it has worked very well. So we pay a very low price for our basic health insurance, and if you want additional stuff, okay, then you start shopping around and you do so, but at your own risk, and you may pay different prices at different places, all fine. But because of this anchoring in a way in the market has become a lot more competitive. I think it's worthwhile to think about something similar in the mortgage market. Why not say, so when I shopped for a mortgage the last time I had to, I tried this out because I was in the middle of the whole process, and I thought, okay, let's experiment a little bit, let's try this out. So I talked to a whole bunch of banks, and they all tried to sell me different products. And I told each one of them the same thing. I said, okay, I'll listen to everything that you want to sell to me, but I want you to give me a quote on this mortgage, and I will tell you what mortgage it is. So I forced them basically to compete on price. I said, this is what I want you to give me a price on this mortgage. It has these terms, 20 years, blah, 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 all the different terms. Tell me how much I would pay for this. So why not have in the mortgage market, similar to what we have in some other markets, we have anybody who wants to be active in the mortgage market in the Netherlands, we have a low risk, medium risk, high risk mortgage. They are exactly the same whether you go to bank A or bank B or bank C, and banks compete on price. If the health insurance market is any evidence, it suggests that we can really benefit from such a system. So if you have any power wherever you are, pitch the idea. So let's change things a little bit.
Most of the people wouldn't know what they're talking about when they enter bank when they go for a mortgage.
But that's also I know, but that's
I want $100,000
but that's also where this is
whatever it is.
But that's also where this is an advantage. So if every mortgage provider has to offer you say, well, you have all kinds of fancy products, but yeah, we also have to offer you, a low, medium, and high risk mortgage, then you have to know less. Because if you don't want to run that risk of buying something that you don't completely understand, you could go for the mortgage that we have decided is a low risk mortgage and is very, very clear and simple. So it would benefit, it would help there as well. Another suggestion which I try to pitch is the idea of safe banks. So one thing that we could do if we cannot radically change the whole banking system and downsize banks and all of these types of things, one thing we could do is we could say, well, if I just want to put my money, my savings, my deposit in a bank, why can't I do so in a bank that I know is only going to invest it in relatively safe things? So it's going to give out some loans, I invest maybe in government bonds, and that's about it. I know that I will get a relatively low interest, but I also know that my deposit is 100% guaranteed. So I don't run any risk. And in other words, I put my money in a safe bank. That's easy to do. It's relatively cheap to actually insure that money. It's cheaper than the current deposit insurance. And then the flip side of that is that you know that if you do not put your money in a safe bank, then it's just like any other kind of industry, and you know that you're running a risk. So think of those two cyclists in Iceland. If one got 3% on a savings account and the other one got 7%, then the 3% one says, yeah, I know I only get 3%, but I know I get it. And the 7% one says, well, I know I get 4% more, but I know also that there's a risk that I lose all of it. Risk and return. It's incentive compatible, makes a lot of sense. Why not try it? At the same time, as I've argued before the break, I think it's also really, really important, and not enough people are talking about it, to think about improving financial literacy. So if we want to change things, we cannot just talk about banks and talk about them as evil creatures. We also need banks, but we need people also to be smarter and understand risk a little bit better. And I think it's time to change that as well and improve financial education. I have become convinced, I should say, that excessive amounts of regulation are tricky, because the more regulation you have, the more difficult it is to actually see whether everybody's sticking to the regulation. But I do want to make a point when it comes to regulation and supervision in the banking system. So think about how we started again, about these two cyclists in Iceland, at these big banks, and then we had these banks that were offering these products that were offering returns that were maybe not realistic, and on the other hand offering these products, these mortgages, that were having risks that maybe were not very transparent. In the supervision of the banking system, we typically make a distinction between two types of supervision. We have the prudential regulation and supervision, so that's prudent, so that's basically setting up the right system, talking about the regulations, looking at whether your risk management is correct, looking at whether your pay and your performance is in line with what it should be, looking at all these things, so the stuff that in most cases, most countries, a central bank does. But we also have behavioral supervision, saying like, yeah, we can have all the rules and you can have all the systems in place, etc. But in the end, it's what you do. And you can have the same bank and there can be a crook working there and there can be a saint working there, and you want to make sure that the crook gets penalized and the saint not. So you want to have also some type of behavioral supervision. And what I find very interesting is that in most countries, including the Netherlands, the prudential supervisor received a lot of criticism, and quite a bit of it was fair, but not all of it, I think. But the behavioral supervisors kept quiet, stayed under the radar, and actually had a relatively smooth sailing through the crisis. Whereas personally, I think if you look at a lot of the things that were happening, it had to do not necessarily with bad regulations or with bad risk management, but it had to do with improper behavior. If I sell a mortgage to somebody who I know cannot afford that mortgage, then I'm not behaving in the proper way. And you cannot expect a prudential supervisor to always be in charge and address these types of things. They're not supposed to. There are other people who are doing this. So I think the people that are watching the markets, that are looking at behavioral supervision, so in the Netherlands, for example, I'll name names, the Autoriteit Financiële Markt. There are similar institutions in other countries. I think that it's time to actually be much more critical of the role that they play, because it's not always prudential. We cannot expect to always prevent things from happening, but we can be a little bit of a policeman and look at what is actually going on. So that brings me almost to the end, and also a little bit to the end of the crisis in a way. So this is the other cyclist. If you watch very, very carefully, you recognize the difference, maybe because one has, I think it's yellow bags, and the other one had other bags. This is the other cyclist. Anybody know which country this is? No. It's the Sierra Nevada in Spain, south of Spain. So these two friends are at it again. This is a couple of years later, and they're biking in the Sierra Nevada, and they notice that wherever they go, there are all these buildings in these little villages that are half finished. And they also notice that in a lot of villages there's not a supermarket anymore, but there are two banks. And they noticed that there are a lot of these villas that were owned by foreigners that are for sale. So that's interesting. Then they decide to climb by bike, apparently, the Sierra Nevada. And after doing that, they call home. And home says, hey, DSB Bank has gone belly up. DSB Bank is a Dutch bank. Oh, and by the way, there's a few of these Spanish banks that are also in trouble. So the one friend says, oh, I got to fill in these forms again, just like with Iceland. And then the other friend says, but how is that possible? Yeah, I also had money on a savings account with DSB Bank, and as a matter of fact, also with one of these Spanish banks. Why am I finishing with that story? Because I want to emphasize that we can talk about banks and the banking system changing and people becoming, and banks becoming too big perhaps and doing too many different things. But as individuals, that's very, very hard to change. But what we can change is the choices that we make. And there's two lessons to learn from this, I think, in this case. So clearly, this one person has not learned his lesson. Because if you were in Iceland biking at the beginning of the crisis, and then you were in Spain biking later on in the crisis, and in both cases you put your money in a high-risk savings account in those countries, then you're not very smart. You could argue. The other point, however, that I want to make is that of the two friends, this is not necessarily the one that lost out. Because the friend that put his money in the Icelandic bank and the friend that put his money in the Spanish bank, in both cases, got his money back. And remember what I said, that there's no free lunch in economics. Well, in these cases, apparently there is. So, if there's one thing that we need to think about is, we didn't just rescue the banks, but we rescued a lot of depositors as well. And just as rescuing the banks actually maybe has created the wrong incentives because they can get away with everything, I'm also not so sure when I talk to individuals how much they have learned from the crisis and whether the current generation, sitting right in front of me, is going to recognize the next one when it comes and whether it's going to do it differently. So don't be like those two cyclists, but be smarter. And it's okay if they fool you once, but if they fool you twice, then you're to blame. So with that, I'm going to close, but not before I do two things. First of all, if you want to see, it's not advertising, but just sort of for validation purposes. If you want to know sort of what kind of research I'm talking about, or if you want to contact me, you can do so here on my website. And secondly, I would like to thank you for your attention and ask you if you have any remaining questions. Thanks.